Hey guys, welcome back to another whiteboard chat, and today we are going to talk about the gut-brain axis. So this was a topic suggestion in my story, and I actually thought it'd be a pretty good topic because a lot of people talk about it, but it's kind of it's in a very vague sense in that they say maintain good gut health because your gut and your brain are connected, or you know, whatever it's right. So doesn't really tell us what it is or what it does or why it's so important. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then also touch on, you know, how you can maintain a good gut-brain axis. So I have a little diagram here, and you can see the brains here at the top, and you can see this magnificent little feedback loop with some, and technically some of these could have arrows going in and out because they do feed in and out from the brain. If you remember on most of the other videos, pretty much all the systems are cyclical, right? No exception here. So what are some of the features of this feedback loop? So we have the actual gut-brain axis here, and then we have some things that are mainly impacted. So down here, the ANS or vagus nerve, so the ANS being autonomic nervous system. So if you guys remember from the autonomic nervous system video, the autonomic nervous system made up of a few different branches, but of really high importance to us are the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches and how they control our fight or flight response. So anyone that's familiar with how sympathetic drive can actually negatively impact the gut, in the same sense, poor gut health or gut dysbiosis can also negatively impact this autonomic nervous system. And I wrote vagus, so vagus nerve, because that's the main nerve that's transmitting signal here. So ENS or enteric nervous system, this is important because the whole gut, or most of the gut, is lined with neurons. These neurons are very important in communicating. So this is one of the main means of communication between the gut and the brain. If you constantly throw insults at the gut, or you have high inflammation, or you have some kind of gut dysbiosis, which we'll talk about, you will potentially have a altered enteric nervous system function or poor enteric nervous system function, which will disrupt these signals between the gut and the brain, which in turn can disrupt a lot of the functions, right? So HPA axis, so we're talking about hypothalamus, we're talking about adrenal glands, again, feeding into the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, neurotransmitters, serotonin, a lot of serotonin derived from the gut, other neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine, all of these things are produced in the gut or metabolized in the gut, or some combination of these things, okay? So neuroendocrine and neuroimmune systems, which we'll talk about a little bit of that up here, but neuroendocrine, endocrine being hormone, neuroimmune obviously being immune function, heavily influenced by the gut, certain metabolites in the gut, certain inflammatory factors, and a couple other things which we'll mention. All right, so I mentioned dysbiosis. So dysbiosis just meaning a poor gut microbiome in some sense of the word. Things, I mean, there's a whole slew of reasons that could happen. Now, a couple of the things that can go on here are, so cytokines, if you remember the inflammation video, I talked about those little boogers, the cytokines, and a main inflammatory driver. Now, they can be good, can be bad. Now, we do need inflammation to protect us from wounds, heal acute injuries, so on and so forth, but in a chronic sense, it's not great. So fermentation in the gut, literally producing ethanol through a certain process in the gut, and that can be very problematic. You can also ferment certain things that you eat. So in high amounts, that can cause problems. Now we know fermented food potentially have benefits because of some of the live cultures that's involved with it, but there are certain people that, too much of that fermentation can also cause issues. Microbial metabolites, or microbe metabolisms, these things are living, right? So there is a metabolism, there is an energy process. They need to derive energy. So these bacteria and living organisms in your gut have to feed, right? All right, so here I mentioned microbiome. Now, microbiome is just that fancy word for gut bacteria or gut environment, right? The overall environment of the gut. So your neuroendocrine and immune mediators. So immune response, a lot of that is derived from the gut because we're getting signals through these inflammatory processes. We're getting signals through the different branches of the adrenal or the HPA. We're getting signals through the ENS. We're getting signals through the ANS, okay? So yeah, there are a lot of immune mediators and neuroendocrine function that goes on in the gut. There are also hormone metabolism is also something that occurs in the gut or in certain regions of the GI tract, especially the liver. I guess you could call that a part. I don't know if you call that a part of the GI tract, but it's an important hormone that is involved in hormone metabolism. All right. Now we can see some inputs here. So stress, obviously, being something that's definitely going to greatly impact the gut-brain axis, and I put that on there just because it's a huge driver for gut dysbiosis. Now, I see this a lot in that people have gut dysbiosis and they try things like elimination diets, and they try things like supplementation, and they do all these things that they suspect might help. And there are cases where they do help, right? There are cases where you have more severe things like SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Yes, supplementation can be important to especially jumpstart the process. But when we have stress as one of the main drivers, have to eliminate that first. I've seen plenty of people with large stress load that have what seems like food intolerances, but once we fix the stress, the food intolerances go away. So they didn't really have, they indirectly had a food intolerance because of stress and because of gut dysbiosis or other things, even like motility issues because of this, stress driver, right? Interrupting the nervous system. So I wanted to mention this because this is I feel this is pretty important, and it's pretty important because we're talking about the brain as well. But psych and behavioral disorders, this was something I thought was really interesting. I hope to see more research about it. There is some research, not a lot. It's not really something that's considered or utilized in our current medical system, at least not here in the US that I'm aware of. But some of you that maybe listened to podcasts before and talked about these subjects, talking about like fecal transplants and how they've been used successfully, or at least seemingly successfully, in people with different psych and behavior disorders, autism, for example. So they essentially transported fecal matter from a normal person with none of these disorders and normal gut microbiome into somebody with these issues, and it greatly improved their symptoms, okay, and behaviors, right? So what this tells us is this feedback loop affected by the microbiome could potentially be manipulated, right? So are there instances where people maybe genetically have gut dysbiosis or genetically have poor microbiome profile that isn't necessarily influenced by diet, or it is influenced by diet, of course, but that's not the primary driver. There's something that they're born with, right? Because we have the ability to produce bacteria and maintain this good gut environment as long as we treat ourselves the way we should be. So some people don't necessarily have this system completely intact. So like I said, what that tells us is that could potentially be some kind of treatment avenue. I've actually had a client that had fecal transplants. It was a alternative medicine type clinic. They literally shipped them to him. He used them, and they did seem to improve. Now, this didn't end up being his underlying issue. There was something else going on, which which later he had figured out. But they did show improvement. Was not a cheap venture, but it is there. I don't know if that's something that'll ever really become available. It would be very cool if it did, but worth a mention for sure. So a couple other little, I guess, honorable mentions. Intestinal permeability. We can go back and forth on leaky gut and whether that's real or not, but essentially we're talking about intestinal permeability and how these junctions become too loose and they allow toxins and different insults and inflammatory mediators and things to pass through into the bloodstream and cause problems. Okay, so yes, that is tied into the gut-brain axis because, again, anything that insults the gut could potentially insult the brain. And I guess, too, while I'm talking about that, what I mean by this, really easy example is, you ever had a stomach ache? You ever had GI issues for, let's say, not just maybe momentarily, but also not just from like eating a large meal, but for like a couple days in a row or even longer, and how it puts you in a bad mood a lot of the time. Well, a lot of that is neurotransmitter disruption, and a lot of this enteric nervous system and autonomic nervous system and HPA being disrupted, right? So these are things that you can literally feel in a short term. Now, there are these other things going on, like these neuroendocrine and neuroimmune system malfunctions, I guess, that you maybe can't necessarily feel or see directly in short term, but they are happening and they can cause, more problems long term. Okay. Inflammation, kind of already mentioned that. I mean, that's one of the largest, probably drivers of this gut dysbiosis. I would say that and stress, especially in our community, just because generally dietary nutrition isn't a huge driver, though there are some obvious things like, food intolerances and eating certain things that might cause, like I said, fermentation or other issues along those lines. So yeah, that does happen, but I'd say that's less of an issue than somebody like a non-nutrition minded person that eats fast food every day. Well, yeah, they can have a ton of gut dysbiosis simply from nutritional lack of, or lack of good nutritional habits, right? So not necessarily the case with our population all the time, but yeah, it is still a driver. Dysbiosis, yeah, like I said, I mentioned that already. Now, I wanted to mention that again because there are other things that can happen there. One that I did not mention too, that I feel like should be mentioned, is motility. So with motility, with this nervous system being affected, this is autonomic, right? It's automatic. So we don't control it, but gut motility is part of an automatic function of muscles, right? Just like your heart beats, well, you don't control that either. So this GI motility, or these contractions that move things down, they can be disrupted if this gut-brain axis is disrupted. So that's important to mention. So bloating or just slow transit times, what feels like things just sit there and maybe don't move through the way they should, that can be a motility issue. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole slew of things that can be connected, and I get asked all the time, well, what do you do? What can you do about it? I mean, depends, right? Just like anything else, it just depends on the situation and what the driver is. But if you have pretty good gut health, you're probably not really going to have a problem with the gut-brain axis, okay? If you have pretty good gut health and then you add pretty good stress management, you're covering both bases. You're covering the input and you're covering the output, or however you want to look at it. You're probably going to be good in both directions. Now, when we say stress management, management, right? That's a whole lot of things. That is your direct emotional and psychological stressors. That is physical stressors. That is your sleep. That is all of those things. So ironically enough, a high total stress load coming from all kinds of things like even training can disrupt your gut. Have you ever had, a lot of people might say no to this, but I know I have, such a hard training sessions that you get diarrhea afterwards? Well, there's a reason for that. That's because of the huge shift in sympathetic nervous system, screwing up your gut motility essentially and digestive process temporarily. Is that something that's going to be like a permanent thing? No. But yeah, stress is a huge driver here. So, best advice is fix your gut health, right? Those can be broken down into small individual topics. You can do things like eliminate common culprits. You can start there, right? You can look at symptoms. What are the symptoms? Are you getting symptoms with meals? Maybe it's a food thing. Maybe it's an acute thing. Are you waking up already bloated? Maybe you have SIBO, right? Maybe it's a bacterial overgrowth. So you're bloated even when you're empty, right? So there's a whole huge amount of things that you would have to know more about the individual topic to address them. But if you control this and you control this, you're not going to have an issue with this. That's pretty much how you can look at it. So I hope this was a helpful video, and we'll talk to you guys next time.